So I have this friend Dan who used to help me lead worship at church, and Dan at the time that he actually started helping me lead worship was an avowed atheist. We'd grown up together in the church, and then over time when he was in school and college, he had given up the faith. He'd come up with a lot of critical questions, confusion, and his mid 20s where he was kind of hopeless in a lot of ways. He just didn't have any sense of where he was going or what he was doing. But he and I had been in a band in high school together, and so I invited him to help me lead worship at the church. Our church was small. We needed somebody, and he was talented, and so he said, "Sure, why not? It's better to play music than do nothing." At the time, he had no job. He was just kind of coasting on some money that he had made with some good investments. He was just hanging out. So he said, "All right," and it was a really fun time. It was incredible. So over the course of 2 or 3 years, he started to reabsorb his faith. His faith started to come back in fits and starts. But he had this thing where he needed his day every year where he could protest, where he could say, "Look, you know what? I'm on this. I'm with you on this God thing. I do believe, but it's really hard because I see the way the world is. I see how it's developed. I see the suffering and the misery, and it's hard for me to, every day be so happy, joyful, whatever." And so Dan had this practice, and every year on Holy Saturday, that's the day after Good Friday and before Easter Sunday, on Holy Saturday, he celebrated the Feast of Dan. And the Feast of Dan was an acknowledgement that today God is dead. So we confess that Christ was crucified. He was laid into the grave, and then on the third day he rose. But what happened in between? And the church had some interesting traditions about him visiting the prison and preaching to the souls there. We're not exactly sure what that means. Some people think there's a tradition called the descent into hell, where Christ goes down into hell and he's preaching to the people who are captive there to get them to believe the gospel or something like that. There's a lot of different ways that Christians have tried to understand that. But for Dan, and he kind of follows the theology of a guy named Jungel, who's a German theologian who talks extensively about the death of God. The idea being that Christ in himself joins the being of the Godhead with nothingness, with death, with absence. And in this very strange, very mysterious way, the incarnation and the crucifixion lead to this bizarre situation in which God, in God's own being, absorbs or takes part in negation, death, non-existence. Jungel's theology draws on a lot of Karl Barth's work, and he's enigmatic, hard to understand, all the way through, but partially because what he's talking about is something that kind of defies possibility, defies understanding. And yet, as Christians, we have to deal with the fact that the man Jesus, who was in himself united, the union of the second person of the Trinity and human nature, that person died. And the Feast of Dan celebrates this, and that was obviously a joke, a little bit sarcastic. But the idea being that here's one day during the year where we're not going to try and answer everything. We're just going to let God be dead. Why is that? It's because, so Good Friday is when we as Christians celebrate suffering, right? The crucifixion. We celebrate the fact that Jesus was willing to go through this excruciating torture because we believed it was productive, it was redemptive. It wasn't senseless, it wasn't pointless. The cross accomplished something. It accomplished forgiveness, it accomplished victory, it accomplished sacrifice. It was a sacrifice for all people. There's a lot of different ways the scriptures talk about what the cross was, but the cross was not just a senseless murder of an itinerant prophet and healer. That's what the cross was not. That's our confession. So Good Friday does talk about suffering, but it talks about a suffering that leads to something. It matters. It's productive or redemptive. And then on Resurrection Sunday, we celebrate the consummation of all things, right? So on Resurrection Sunday, we're celebrating what the end will finally be like, where our bodies are taken out of the grave, where all suffering and evil end, and they're overcome by the victory and the right making of God, and that a new society, a new heavens and a new earth, a new place will be created that's right for human life, a glorified human life that's not subject to the vagaries of life as we know it. And so we have, Good Friday, we have Resurrection Sunday, and yet in between we have Holy Saturday, we have the Feast of Dan. It's the time when we just live with the fact of existence in all of its negation, in all of its absurdity, in all of its failure. Interesting. Check out ICT chapter 8, and the very last section talks about Holy Saturday, and it kind of has a take similar to Dan's, but a little more hopeful about what Holy Saturday is, what it is to be with this moment in between times. And one of the things they bring out is that if you're willing to have your life punctuated by these three types of existence, then you're full, you're whole, right? There's times in life where we experience and to some extent undergo suffering, but a lot of times we can actually see the value in it, much like the cross, and that there is a point to what's happening. It's not just pointless, not miserable. And then there are also times in our life where we're just alive in the fullness of the good gifts of the Spirit and the unity of the church, where life is full and it's glorious. It's a picture, it's a preview of what is to come at the end. But there are also times in life in between those two things, where the suffering is real and it's difficult to see how productive it is. And it's hard to know if resurrection is coming. It's dark and it's empty. As Christians, we can acknowledge that Jesus too, or the Trinity too, knows this time in between, in this death of God, in this absorption of all of the world's violence, all of the world's negation, all of its emptiness and death, that too is absorbed and held in God's being. And it's mysterious, and there's no way to truly articulate it, although Jungel does a very fine job of trying. But it's a moment. And that's the thing, though. Christians have the confession that it's a moment. It's not the only place we live. It's actually a place we pass through. Just as Christ passes through Holy Saturday to Resurrection Sunday, so too we, as believers and as human beings, pass through the times of emptiness and senselessness and suffering and evil. We pass through them, and we can sit with them. We can be with them, and we can be curious and concerned and fearful that there won't be a Resurrection Sunday. It's okay to be there. That's not wrong. We trust that Resurrection Sunday does come, that it is not a fantasy, that it does actually enter into life, that God does not just stay negated, God does not just absorb death and that's the end. God overcomes death. And so because we know that, because we can hold that out and say that's a part of our calendar, that's a part of the story that we tell, that it's okay to be in the hard part too, in the middle part, in the Feast of Dan.